Welcome to the 2-Month Review, the weekly podcast from Open Letter and 3%, in which we take a single book, break it down section by section, bit by bit, talk about it, how to make jokes, analyze it, figure it out, and take complicated books and make them enjoyable, easy, and fun to read. I'm Chad Post from Open Letter Books, and this week we're joined by Anthony Blake, who is also from Open Letter.
That's me. Hello.
And special guest Hailey Dezort, who actually worked here at Open Letter for a short time some years ago.
Hi, guys.
But where are you? I forgot to look up the name of where you are now.
No worries. I'm with K Publicity, so it's a boutique PR firm in Chicago that focuses on publishing and entertainment. So,
cool. How do you like it?
I love it. I mean, I work from home. Like, my first out of the gate college career job is like working from home full time. Like, I'm blessed.
Millennial. Such a millennial.
I have a co-working space with other millennials that I hang out at and do.
And you guys talk about K-cups and craft brews.
Basically, just like going to breweries for lunch. No, I'm just kidding. But
memories of when Justin Bieber was out was so cool.
I think I was a little old for Justin. Okay. Wrong age group, but
The Bieber fever.
I'm just giving you shit, Hailey. Thank you for coming on to talk about Radiant Terminus. So for anyone who hasn't caught on, whatever, we're doing Radiant Terminus by Antoine Volodine this month, these 2 months. And today we're specifically talking about the first 77 pages, which are the first 3 chapters. But before we get into that, before we get into any part of actually talking about it, you, Hailey, are subject to the weekly challenge, in which we decided that we would take one of the names of a post-exotic writer that Volodine has, because I think his names are wonderful. They're like more bizarre than like Thomas Pynchon names. Like Thomas Pynchon names are funny. His are like crazy and like don't seem to have like any real nationality, but are evocative in other ways. So I'm going to give you a name, and you have to tell me what this person does. In your world, they can't be a writer. You don't have to worry about like what kind of post-exotic writing they did or whatever. Just when I say a name, what do you imagine this figure would be? Ready?
Okay.
Are you ready?
No, but give it to me. Let's see.
Khrili Gompo. Khrili Gompo.
Okay, the first thing that honestly came to my mind was like a fat, like hippie dude that's just like sitting and smoking some weed and like writing some manifestos and like has like some like shitty tie-dye shirt on and sandals.
There we go. You did it.
That's it. That's what came
Khrili
to mind.
Gompo is. I'm gonna wait. Well, this is a highlighter. This isn't even.
And he probably has some like interesting wisdom to part onto us, but with that look, no one's really into.
We're gonna make a list of these by the end of the season of who all these people are. Maria Scragg is a failed tennis player who just didn't quite make it. Khrili Gompo is a fat hippie.
This is about to be a really eclectic cast of characters at the end of this.
I feel like it's perfect. Like it's kind of like the heteronyms come to life in like a great way. Because he always describes like the names in these books are like almost tokens in a sense. Like there are characters that embody them, as you guys know, like Kronauer is Kronauer. But when it gets into referencing like who the writers are, and it'll say like this post-exotic writer who wrote like feminist books. It never defines that person. That person doesn't have like an existence outside of like that book or like the type of writing they have. So like we're bringing these heteronyms to life.
I love it. It's going to be ridiculous.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So what did you think of the first 3 chapters?
I really liked. So I had no idea what to expect. Honestly, I'd never read Volodine before. Like I knew that it was like science fiction-y. I had listened to the first episode of the introduction that you and Brian had done. So Brian had mentioned the world building being really interesting, and I'm a huge fantasy sci-fi geek, so I was so pumped about it. What I thought was so interesting was that there's like these like slivers of information that he like drops in that make you feel like it's really connected to our current world, but then it's so exotified and it feels
would you say post-exotic?
Post-exotic. It feels still very foreign, and you feel like he's still really building something out that is interesting and has some kind of magic to it, but then is also very bleak and dystopian. So it was really interesting to see how he did that, especially with I started Googling the plant names So I was like,
Yes,
are
me
these
too.
real?
Yeah,
They're not
But
real,
they're not
right?
real. They're not
So-
real.
I meant to text Jeffrey about that actually, to find out like how he came up with this. Jeffrey Zuckerman, who translated, is going to he'll participate in this in one way or another, but I'm hoping that he'll write something for the website about his translation experience. But I wanted to ask him specifically about how he came up with those names, because I imagine like they're wild, they're not real things in French. So I guess you just translate the word, but that's not really, it feels weird because there's no referent then.
Well, there was like some that had English words, like it was like
Yeah.
Jan, and I was like, what?
Maybe, but I wonder what that was in the original book.
Right. So that was really interesting. But then also the plants had like more of a life of their own, like within this like very decayed world, which I thought was like how nature was coming through. It felt really beautiful to read as you're reading kind of all of these like fucked up, like just like the kind of environment that they're in. It's insane.
That's why I think that's why Music for Plants is going to be the opening and ending track for every single single episode of this season. I like that album quite a bit. Like I never heard of it, but Brian turned me on.
Yeah,
it's nice. Yeah. We used to have a Moog when I was in college. My roommate did, God. And we would be in another state, and we would play that thing for hours, and it was just the most fun to like come up with crazy noises, and you could almost never replicate them. Like there's so many different options that at some point it was impossible to remember how you came to do one particular thing. So it was like endless, like weird stone jazz. We were Khrili Gompo, basically, but with a Moog, imparting wisdom via sounds.
Via plant music.
So I figure in this too, we could take this, since this is one, in contrast to Pessoa, which was a nightmare, to try and recap, just not nightmare full stop, nightmare to recap, but because there's no plot through lines. This one does clearly have a plot and has settings and has situations and brings up different things with each of the different chapters. So I feel like for this, we could go through chapter by chapter. I could sort of summarize. We could talk about some of the main points or things that came up to you guys. So with the first chapter is we basically start with Kronauer and his two comrades, whose names I didn't write down, which hopefully you guys did.
It's I'm gonna butcher these. I think it's
I can't say them.
Vasilisa, and which is definitely not how you pronounce it, and Ilyashenko.
Ilyashenko is good.
Is that? I think I added an A, but whatever.
Yeah, whatever. Ilyashenko and Vasilisa have left the Orbis, which has fallen, which is essentially the second Soviet Union. There had been a second Soviet Union. The fascists started uprising. Everything fell apart. They were involved in like some rebellion force that was going to try and restore the order of the second Soviet Union, the Orbis. And their captain was insane and was getting them basically butchered for no reason. So they kill him and run away outside of where the gates were, outside into like the wasteland, the Tarkovskian wasteland of like the rest of the world, of this world, and are trying to make their way, knowing that they're going to die. All of the nuclear reactors have been set up throughout this whole vast space to be able to power. I mean, the Soviet Union had taken over the world, we find out later, basically, except for like a few holdouts. And they have all these little communes that are powered by nuclear reactors, which just went awry and all imploded. So there's radiation everywhere. They know they're going to die. There's not a lot of hope. They get to like the Red Star commune, see a train come up with a bunch of weird soldiers that kind of fall out, and Vasilisa is dying. And so Kronauer decides he's going to go get water for her by he sees a smoke in the distance and feels like he can go. Must be a village. He'll get water. He'll bring it back. She will live. Good?
That's a great summary.
That's pretty much what happens. Yeah.
It's pretty much the thing. But then there's like other observations within that, obviously.
Yeah.
Well, and it's like so interestingly paced because it's broken up by long descriptions of landscape. The word Tarkovskian is in the jacket copy, and I was like, oh, this is Volodine. That can't be Tarkovskian, because he's having read Bardo and Post Exotic and then reading some of the Draeger. I'm like, no, he's goofy, like he's fun, like he's bouncing around doing these weird philosophical meanderings. It can't be Tarkovskian. And it so is. Like he's slow, like looking and like moving like in this dystopian Soviet landscape. It's so interesting how different it is from his other stuff. And so
Yeah.
a lot of what I was thinking was like, okay, what are the ways that this is linked to other Volodine projects that I've read already?
One that's funny that you mentioned that, because the first point that I put down is that when he starts naming those plants that we were talking about, like he doesn't remember. So Cronauer had a girlfriend who dies violent in like the most worst way, and I want to come back to that in a second.
Yeah,
but
that was tough.
Well, that's the first of a many tough things that we'll talk about in this episode. But he had a girlfriend who was a botanist who taught him about plants. He doesn't remember anything about the plants because, why would you? Your entire world is irradiated and you're dying. So he starts naming everything. And one of the first books that was translated in English, the first book by Volodine translated in English, is Naming the Jungle. And there's not exactly a parallel there, but there is this bit about in Naming the Jungle about how they create words to define things, that you have to use the right word in this area, in this jungle. Otherwise it doesn't mean the right thing. So you can't say like mosquito, you have to use the term for mosquito that's used by that particular newly invented sort of tribe. And this also has that kind of Adam moment of like post-apocalyptic world in which Cronauer gets to start naming what the plants are. And they stay, I don't know if consistent's the wrong word, but some of those keep reappearing as he's like walking through the jungle and crossing it, that he's sort of taking over that landscape. So he's almost like the first man in that space being able to do that, which I thought was pretty cool and like subtle, but it does sort of tie back in that way, I think.
Yeah, I think for me, that was one of the things that brings everything together across the heteronyms, is like naming and having the right thing to call something is super important.
Yeah.
I've had like no experience with like the other ones except for Manuela Drager from the Dorothy. That was like, just when you see the like in later chapters, like them bringing up like the stories that they're being told by like the feminists. So that's just kind of what drew me in. And then there's a mention of the Bardo and that kind of like limbo existence. And then I was like, okay, like this is like you even though I have like very limited knowledge of his other works, you still see, if you know anything, like those kind of connections, the connective tissue between the worlds.
Yeah, I want to bring up the Bardo again in a little bit, because I think they have a theory of one way to like approach this. But there is a moment, I don't remember if I underlined it because I was reading this at the gym, but where because I'm a nerd and I bike and read my books like a loser. But whatever. That's cool. But there's a part where she's saying, where Vasilisa's dying, and she's like, no, those people were dead and we're inside of those other people's dream. Like
I underlined that. It's like on page 17.
There we go.
Yep. Where she says, maybe we're already dead, all three of us, and what we're seeing is their dream.
The very David Lynchian, very Twin Peaksy in there. Finally, a Twin Peaks reference. Been waiting for that.
Yeah, so we should mention that we're still doing 2-month review bingo. We've got at least a few crossed off because
major technical difficulties.
Possibly mispronouncing a foreign name.
100%.
Definitely.
I don't want to throw under the bus there, but possibly.
And we do have new merchandise for anyone watching that we're going to try and maybe sell these shirts that we made, the books and books and books and books shirts. So if you want one, you have to email us though, because we haven't placed an order and we want to know how many people would be interested in such a shirt. So merch too. So anyone playing bingo, go for it. You're all in.
Yeah. So we got at least a few already.
One of the things that so you read a lot of science fiction stuff and post-apocalyptic stuff too, Hailey?
Not necessarily post-apocalyptic. I mean, it's more fantasy and like epics and things like that. Like post-apocalyptic, not necessarily, but it's just like interesting seeing like the made-up names and kind of the world building is like most familiar to me, which I geek out about, and seeing like how it's constructed.
Yeah. I think he does a great job of that too, because everything's very visual. Like it's a very visual book compared to what you might expect, like thinking this book's going to be difficult or crazy or whatever. It's a very visual and easy to like imagine space, even though it's very not imaginable in a sense.
Well, isn't it? Well, when I was surprised, like when opening this, like how the narrative structure, like it's very easy to get into, to be honest, the books you've picked before for the 2-month review. I was like, what am I getting myself into? But it's like easy to follow along. But what I found like interesting is like the kind of like the literary moments, right? Like this feels very science fiction-y and has that world building, which I feel like some people, I think Brian mentioned this in the last episode, where you feel like it loses its literary merit in kind of building those kinds of stories, whereas you don't feel that at all. But I think he's attacking so many different important things or topics or controversial issues in it that also lend itself to being feeling more literary.
Right. Yeah. I agree with that. There was a time where I feel like I read a bunch of there's a bunch of writers who had like post-apocalyptic related books that came out around the same time, like the Margaret Atwood series and that Gary Steingart book even or whatever. But there was like a bunch of them, and this isn't particularly novel idea or anything. But I always thought that one of the central questions with those books would be after like humanity has been wiped, like it more or less is, like there's not that many survivors, is when you get down to that baseline of whether or not people are essentially good or essentially bad. Like, are they going to be selfish and, take care of only themselves, or are they going to be helpful, or like, where is that going to fall? And like, there's not one answer or the other, but a lot of these books tend to come to that question or have to answer it in some way. And I think that these first 3 chapters sort of predicate a few things for that I think are kind of interesting. Like well, if we skip ahead a bit, that Kronauer seems to be good and is being treated as good, whereas this being set up against a very bad human being or very bad person.
Extremely. Something I found interesting that they kind of introduced kind of along those lines, like who is good and bad, is also the idea of like sexual relationships. Yes. Like almost immediately, and I think it's in the first chapter with Ilyushenko and Vasilia, whatever, and Kronauer. How do you Kronauer? Like knowing that their whole like stability would fall apart if one of them had a romantic relationship with her. And then again, when you see the daughter of like in the later chapters, this like fear of men and rape and sexuality.
Yeah, absolutely. Related to that too, the part, so we'll jump from here, then we can go into the second chapter and get into the Radiant Terminus commune. But the part on 25 about the girlfriend or the wife, I guess they were married for 10 years. Kronauer's wife, Irina Echeguian. God knows, God help me. These aren't supposed to be pronounced. At all.
No.
Where she dies because she's dying of cancer, and like these men, counter-revolutionaries, burst in to the common room where she'd been resting with a dozen other female cancer patients, tore out tubes and needles, broke all the medical equipment, and then raped the women, even the ones who already looked like corpses, as a group of dog-headed enemies, zealots for exploiting men for the sake of men. They deserted the place, but before they left, they killed Irina Echeguian, which is horrifying and disturbing and awful, and sort of points to something that seems to come up a lot, where men are they are violent and insane. That is the options that are available. So like the commander of their the revolutionary army that's fighting to try and preserve the Orbis, they're like, he was all fucked up and crazy and nonsensical and violent and sending us to die in various places. So we had to kill him. But it's like I love this actually. I'll read the part where it says that the commander apparently wanted to recapture their Obese by calling on demonic, alien, and kamikaze forces. They moved around the capital's periphery without any strategy, submitting to his senseless but iron will. The commander gave absurd orders, sent men on suicide bombings where there are no victims aside from civilians and themselves. And are immediately postulating that men are evil, violent, and insane. And I think that's kind of...
Even Kronauer, who is like, we're saying he's on the better end of the spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
He is kind of the option when the war is happening to like be in the training and the propaganda portion of it, or to like go fight. And he's like, I prefer violence over talking about violence.
Yep.
So he's the good one, and he's still like, yes, violence, let's do it.
Yeah. It's curious. And to see how it'll play out, I think.
Yeah.
Well, and that was really interesting because there's this consistent discussion of I think the intelligence and the education that these characters have had that keeps coming in, and he isn't fully acknowledged. He kind of stops that education and doesn't care to further that kind of intellectual knowledge. But also there's a space or a passage that I think kind of goes back to it bringing up that question about this like kind of good or bad. And they talk about, I think it's on page like 26, we had no explanation when we interrogated ourselves about humanity's bad choices. Kind of like there wasn't, they couldn't even, there was really no answer for all of the fucked up shit that kind of happens as a result.
And like the next part of it, Marxist optimism prevented us from seeing the proof of serious defects in the genetic heritage of our species. An idiotic affinity for self-destruction, a masochist apathy in the face of predators, and perhaps even above all, a fundamental inability when it came to collectivism. So like there's also that idea that the base thing is like all fucked up, but then you use the ideology to sort of shield yourself from being able to interrogate that or to know that that's what's happening or that's what the situation is. And that ideology thing is going to come up in chapter 2 a lot, which we'll jump to now, which is a section where we're in Radiant Terminus. So he had left the Red Star commune to go through the woods to get to where he thought there was a village. There is a village. It's called Radiant Terminus. There is a nuclear reactor core that's dropped down 2 kilometers that's taken care of by Gramma Ugdul. Gramma Ugdul. Don't know who's unaffected by radiation, can live forever, doesn't age, and takes care of the core by going down into it and talking to it, and also like every so often dumping a bunch of shit that needs to be dumped into it. So it's like they're like trash compactor, nuclear trash compactor. And so she's there at this commune with her, which is run by anyone want to take a guess at this?
What is it?
Solovier?
Solovier?
Solovier. Sure.
That sounds Soviet.
It does sound very Soviet.
Second Soviet.
He is in charge. She had known him many years before, like 100 years before, whatever.
She was married to him.
She was married to him. Time is a flat black disc in this too. Like there's no 100 years can pass in a second. And she then meets him there because she's getting away from. She's still like part of the Soviet belief system at the time that she gets to this commune and sees him again. And he had always been a radical, had tried to break away, went way out. She decides to go way out into the country too, where there's no hope, but she's still going to be part of like the Marxist Soviet beliefs. She sends back reports for a while and then doesn't. But then and they wouldn't get them anyways. And so then it's not like there's anyone like, isn't this the one where like the last
the mailman dies?
Yeah, the mailman dies.
And then they think that she has been killed or something of that sort.
And so she's there taking care of shit. He's in charge of things. We'll talk about him more in a second. And then his other part that she does is she's supposed to collect and organize all of Solovier's whatever his writings, which include a bunch of black cylindrical discs that are some sort of weird like dream-like state of or like Bible, like futuristic Bible. They're crazy. I have a question for you specifically about that, Anthony. But yeah, so that's basically this chapter, sort of setting up what that situation is. But the thing that struck me most about this, in going through it, was how funny her bits are. Like when she talks, they're really funny. So we've gone like we're in this horror scape that's going to only get worse, but yet she is like a source of like kind of humor.
She sits in that armchair, which is like she's a grandma, you know, but also she's doing all this stuff. Yeah, it's wild.
Dark funny is what I wrote next to the part about the mailman dying. But there's also like this part where it's where they're talking about when she has her dream and she dreams that she falls asleep and dreams that she's with like some young hot Soviet at this ball and they're dancing, but then she wakes up and she can't remember. She can remember his face, but she can't remember if like she was young or if she was old in the dream or what happened next. And she thinks that if she was young, she would have like gone and they would have had sex. If she was older, like it would not have worked out. And so the forgetfulness bothered her because in the second case, the next part of the dream couldn't have been what it would have been in the first case. And deep down, she hoped she had a dream adventure with this heroic worker who had held her tenderly in his arms, who twirled her to the accordion sounds until dizziness caught hold of her and forced her to leave the dance floor. It's such a funny thing in the contrast to like all this weird like nuclear holocaust that's gone on. And you have like this like little weird romantic moment. And then immediately after that, she opened her eyes and growled the jumbled curse that tore the Marxist classics a new hole.
Yeah, that was great.
It's great. Love it. But I think that her part's being funny is like a nice offset. So it makes it clear that this isn't going to be just like all awfulness.
Well, and then like her part, there is like, it's so nonchalant. Like she is going and like getting rid of this like radioactive waste. She's like casually immortal, which like time in these is like introduced in the first chapter, and it's like time goes slowly and things like that. And so you're like a little kind of like, who actually has been like, who's like not immortal, who's immortal, who's affected by radiation, who's not. Like there's this constant back and forth, and you're not quite sure who or what is like affected or not affected. But then they're like just like sending in scientists with her to get rid of this waste, and they all casually die within the first 3 weeks. He's like, okay, like
and then
the government's like irritated that she won't die. They're like, you're supposed to be a martyr, like everyone's a martyr, just go martyr. And she won't die. And just when they quit hearing from her, they're all just like, well, we'll just say she's dead because that fits the story better.
Yep. I love that. This isn't the chapter where they dump the teacher though. That's in the next one. Yeah, never mind.
I wanted to get to that too.
Yeah, I was well, and then like her confidant is like the radio. It's this well in a way, right? Yeah. Like that's who she's like, I'm telling stories to, and I'll discuss with the core later. And like for a minute, I was like, is there like a monster in the core? I'm so there was like this moment of like, what is in this core? But then I just think like she sounds very lonely and like a grandma that's like mind isn't quite there, and they're just dumping things.
I don't know. I think maybe she is talking to the nuclear core, and like it's her buddy. It's keeping her alive somehow.
I'm I'm intrigued. I'm invested in her conversations with the core.
I do like, so Solveig, whatever, he is introduced in here, and he's introduced in ways that are like hint at his horrifying nature. Although the first time he's really introduced, I think, is funny, where it says Solveig took pride in not only being a revolutionary, but also a poet. And so he felt that he had the right to say anything that went through his head loud and clear. Which I feel
basically like the process. Yeah, that's basically how it works.
You're a poet, you get to just speak it. And he's like, the prospect of having to write lies to save his skin infuriated him. He sabotaged his self-criticisms by inserting esoteric narrax, considerations of the apocalypse, and politically incorrect discourses on sexuality and dreams. So he distanced himself from Soviet stuff through like crazy writings and rants. There's another part that references his like sort of weirdness in here too, where it's like on 48. He had built his own existence around values besides heroism, and says he was president of the did you say Kolkhoz? I'm not sure how you say that. The commune. He gave priority to black magic, to incursions into the world of dreams and parallel universes filled with zombies, wonderful daughters, animals, and fires. Which is great too.
What a list. Wonderful daughters, zombies.
And that's hinted at on 42. Solveig's moments of madness, his immoderate love for his daughters, the physical deterioration of the last Kolzniks, the water leaks that flooded her toilet. So this is where Gramma's thinking about him and like her situation. And that immoderate love for his daughters is like a huge tip forward of setting up our essential conflict.
It's going to be a big thing. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. There's just like with like their relationship, like Solveig and Gramma, I just like love that she's like decides there's like the sentence where she's like, and decides to love him again, even though she's like, I know he's batshit crazy. And like consistently and I feel like that also comes from this point where previously in the chapter, you're going through these steps where she's like very isolated, very alone. Like the party pushes her away because she is immortal, and they're like very bitter about that because everyone else is apparently going to die from radiation but her, and now I guess him, because I think he's immortal.
He seems immortal too, or a mutant of some sort.
Of some sort. But is it in this chapter where, she kind of acknowledges that they're both like these monsters in a way as well. And like, she kind of finds some solace in being with him because so frequently she was left alone. And I think it's like kind of this direct result of like, yeah, she always had this like love for him, and that's obvious from the beginning, but it was never enough for her to like exile herself for, whereas like now it very much is. And that to me was interesting. Like this, I think she mentions like, this is not what I had imagined my exile to be, but like, yet here she is. And I think that is like just kind of very interesting seeing that transition of even the dialogue between them. Like she definitely still has the party's ideals, and they're kind of having this like kind of cute, adorable banter with each other. She's like, I'm going to just throw your archives into the core because they're trash.
And she's like, how am I supposed to like organize these? There's no dates. They're just like rambling. So he's like, no, they're of the past, present, and future. She's like, yeah, exactly. But she does say that like when he plays one of his recordings, which I want to ask you about, Anthony, but then she says, it's too far from socialist realism for me, she sighed. It's just poetic, slightly perverse nonsense, petit bourgeois fantasy. It's like a threatening riddle. None of it makes sense. Which is my experience.
What's the question there?
I know that's
Why
like my
poetry?
reaction to it. But what do you make out of the poetic sections? I sort of skim them. Like I read them and I'm like, these are like crazy images and I don't know what to process out of them or like what to make out of them. But some of the images seem to keep recurring, like the fire, like the bird mask, like the stuff. And I wondered if you had a different approach as someone who's more of a reader of poetry and well-versed in poetry and knows that and is accustomed to things that are slightly more in this vein. If you had a more detailed reading of them.
I don't think so, because I think the book is not asking me to read them as if they are like good poetry.
Right. No.
So I think I'm like with you. I'm skimming it and I'm gonna kind of understand what this person is through what he's saying, but I don't think the language is like supposed to be terribly interesting, and I don't think it is.
Okay, fair enough. Makes sense.
But okay, wait, going back to their banter, I just wanted to read one line.
Yeah.
It's when they're going back and forth about these ideologies. If I were the president, you wouldn't escape the firing squad. Grandma laughed lightly, which I think is hilarious because it's such a dark thing to say to somebody, and they're just laughing about it.
Yeah.
I think that kind of encapsulates the whole chapter. This like weird humor.
Yeah, absolutely. There's one last part from here, and then we can move on. I like the part where she's part of her like just pass the time. She reads newspapers from the previous century where like the news was still good. So it's like the newspaper was from the previous century, but the news was encouraging. And then she gets interrupted. This is where he explains this actually. So the newspaper was from the previous century, but the news was encouraging. The revolution made headway on all fronts, and the number of battles increased. At that point, the Second Soviet Union covered most of the globe. There were still several distant continents with pockets of aggressive capitalists, but there was no denying that the domestic nuclear disasters had made the survival of the world population rather problematic, but the situation had improved, at least under the military plan. And then she's like, she gave up the headlines, dipped in the pages inside. She looked for the weather report to compare the printed information with the reality of the sky above Radiant Terminus, and came again to the conclusion that the press was full of nonsense. I love that turn of like, reading these things where it's like, yeah, things weren't the worst yet. And like, also, this thing is garbage. It doesn't describe our current situation. Nonsense, fake news. So part 3, we go back to Kronauer. He's in the woods approaching Radiant Terminus and finds a woman. He finds, is it Samaya? Is how you say her name?
Samia?
Yeah.
Samia. Samia
Schmidt. She was a great. None of these names make any sense.
I laughed so hard when I like saw the last name was Schmidt. I was like, this just seems so out of place.
Like Kronauer, Solveig, Gramma Ugdul, and then Samia Schmidt.
So many of these characters are just in the same. They're all in their 30s, you know,
forever.
Or like they were in their 30s and now they're 130.
Yeah,
it's like this weird recurring.
But look like they're 30.
Yeah,
but also look like they're a corpse. You know, like it just kind of really goes.
And like that's a good part. Actually, referencing the time thing. On the first time that Gramma Ugdul is introduced, it says that she was about her 80-year-old. So it's describing about her beliefs about her 80-year-old in shape body doomed to eternity. 100 years earlier, she had begun her career. So it's like immediately like time doesn't make any sense. Like has an 80-year-old body that 100 years ago she was already like in her 30s working on like whatever. So it's fun how that gets broken. So Kronauer finds Samaya in the woods. She's like passed out and not doing well, and he's trying to find water, and he's like, is there someplace nearby? And she's like, yes. But I can't take you there because of my dad. And he's like, well, you need help. I'll carry you. And she's like, you don't carry me because he's going to kill you. Like, you're going to get fucked up. And he's like, no, it'll be fine. And he carries her. And this is where the comment of like her saying like, he actually didn't take advantage of her. Nothing like was sexualized. It was very much like he just was taking care of her, and takes her back towards the Radiant Terminus, where as he gets close, he's violently attacked in his mind by Solovey. And again, this is the first time that we get both Solovey's glimpse of his like power, if this were like a comic book or a comic book movie, like his like whatever ability to enter people's minds, and the very, very, again, trigger warning for this book of like her PTSD because he has been essentially mind raping his daughters for their entire existence. And we get the picture in this case of for the third chapter, more about the daughters and their relationship to their dad and what's like growing up in Radiant Terminus. And it's a fucking horror show.
Well, something that I like, it draws back on like the past two chapters, and like this, like these ending scenes of like him mind raping his daughters, and also like his daughter consistently worrying that Kronau is going to physically hurt her, is that I think that also the relationships that have like the potential for a romantic, maybe a better romantic side to it, you know, between Vasilisa and Kronau or Ilyashenko, or even between Gramma and Slovey, is that none of it's actually consummated, like as like a like in any sexual way. Like there's hints to it, and even in the like second chapter, I think it mentions that Solovey has this, like he still has those urges, but the relationship between him and Gramma is like hardly sexual, even though they have this love. But then like any kind of real sexual act is just rape in this novel for the most part, between like the violence that's enacted on Kronau's wife, and then also the mind raping of Kronau and his like Slovey's daughters, which I think is really interesting. I don't know what you guys were kind of getting from that, because I was like, the only sexual acts that are being committed is really rape. And then anything that has the potential to have, I think, a healthier sexual relationship is dismissed.
Even beyond like the sexualized part of it, there is like that reference earlier where it's like we couldn't even tell, because we were believing in this Marxist stuff, we didn't realize how to actually be a collective. And I think like how to connect as people without using an ideology or a pre-described form for it is difficult in this novel. And that's part of their challenge. The three of them at the beginning seem to fall into this sort of brother sisterhood that works. But that's as close as we've gotten to like or I guess the Gramma Ugdul and Solveig have like some sort of relationship that works, but it's like more of that kind of human coming together, even the sex part. But the men always are the worst parts for obvious reasons. Like on 61, who's speaking here? Oh, he said that with great effort, and the woman quickly realized that he was hiding something. His words rang false. He was putting up a front. She was starting to be afraid of him again as a male, as a rough-hewn soldier guided by bad intentions, who might be violent, who might have sordid sexual needs, and who might murder sordidly. Like all of those things, like boom, 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 is like men are very dangerous in this book and very not to be trusted, and are violent, insane, and going to rape.
And well, for the most part, that's kind of true. Like he was a soldier and like wanted to enact violence. Like he isn't, and like in that moment trying to enact violence on her. But when she's thinking about like men and his like the characters, like it rings true. Like in it, even in that moment, if it's not particularly true to their circumstance, which I found to be really interesting, that even kind of removed from those moments, like that's still within that character.
Yeah, and then she even drills it home. All men try to hurt women. That's their specialty. Like this is a terrible terrible world, and like, you know, not an entirely fantastical one. But it's really driven home in here in like very, very stark fashion. One thing that I thought was funny, to switch this for 1 second, is when 62, where it's like Samaya Schmidt was the third daughter of Solovey. She was born to an unknown mother, is an interesting inversion of the usual like unknown father. It's just like someone had her, I don't know, like she was born. But yeah, so then I don't know how we want to get into this. So he basically I'll do the describing again. Trigger warning for everyone. He wants to set up a school for them and have them learn. His 3 daughters learn things, and but he doesn't want like them to be violated or in any way encountered by the people who teach there. So, which leads to one of the guys being thrown into the core for lecherously looking at one of the daughters.
The best part of that is like Grandma allows it, and it says something like, "Even though it wasn't even a work day."
Yeah,
that's so good.
Oh my God, it's so wild. And then so he has this school where Samaya meets her husband eventually. She marries the tractor driver who comes to the school once in a while, and that'll come up, I think, late. Well, I'll come up to that in a second. But it does keep saying, and 65 is the most horrifying passage about this, where it says Solovey has some power to be able to go into people's dreams, which, yeah, let's just take it at face value for now. He took advantage of his visit to explore the nooks and crannies of their consciousness, their fantasies, their secret desires. The girls respected Solovey and did not deny him their love, but from the day they had their first periods, they began to hate this sort of intrusion, this imperious and unnatural penetration. And in the morning, silently or openly, they remembered that he had appeared within them, that he had disturbed their privacy, that he had forced himself on them to explore the hidden secrets of their unconscious and their body in general. They could not forgive him for that. Is like way fucked up. And in some ways, like, because it's not described, like just a rape described is awful, but like in this way, it's like also awful, even though it doesn't have any of the sort of physical details. It's so unnerving. And that's where I said, referencing like the Jessica Jones Purple Man thing, like Kilgrave in that show can like control people's thoughts and goes into women's heads and like makes them do horrible things. And like, that's such a fucking terrifying thing to me.
Well, what I found like to be really interesting about like taking it from the aspect of it being like him in their minds is like, right, that description of like their nooks and crannies, like that's just like such a deep violation that I think when people like can talk about like sexual assault and rape and things like that in like a more physical way, like forget to acknowledge like the deep psychological impacts. Whereas I think when he's doing this and describing this, I feel like in a way shows the ramifications of what like an actual physical rape would also be like for a woman. And I feel like he doing that and not describing the physical like really drives it home, like the psychological traumas of it. Like you see when she's in the forest or Cronau, like how terrified she is and like thinks of men. And I think in a way, like he's able to show the symptoms and the consequences of that PTSD and that trauma without in a way that's better than almost not like better, but like in a way that when describing like a physical rape might not even to a reader like understand those ramifications, where this is easier to see that connection through their mind. So that's kind of where I felt like this was an interesting and like smart way of showing that trauma and like and the ramifications to it.
There is like on that next page is after her marriage to Morgovian, and it talks about how it wasn't like it wasn't a catastrophe, but nobody would say that it made her happy. Morgovian was afraid of her and he behaved himself as a result. And then it goes on a little bit and then says he was terrified by the bouts of insanity she sometimes had, during which she would run as fast as possible through their house and through the main road of the Kolkhoz, scarcely touching down on the ground and whispering extraordinarily violent and strange curses. And like it's clear that that's like part of her PTSD from all the things that have gone off with their dad. And related to what you're saying about like the internal like description of rape and like the internal like process of what happens with that, on 76, after they get close, there's a voice that goes into Cronauer's head and one of those poems sort of appears, and it's filled with like the crazy like fire and the masks and all that kind of stuff. And it's her dad, it's Solovey, and he's like inside Cronauer's mind. And after he leaves, Cronauer thinks about it, and this seems very like in tune with what happens there too, of getting at that internal side. He had clearly felt someone creeping inside him, settling in and sauntering around his cranial vault without the least respect for his privacy. It was both psychical and physical. He was talking to him and violating him. He who was speaking the poem had raped him and then pulled out. Cronauer hadn't known how to defend himself against this outrage, how to stop this aggression, and now he felt wretched. His passiveness had upset him terribly, and somehow he felt both guilty and dirty. And then he turns away, Connor made sure that Samaya wasn't watching him through her eyelashes. He would rather that she didn't see his shame. He still felt like he had endured an assault, which seems in keeping like with what you were saying about that trying to depict that the ramifications that aren't necessarily the physical, but the real core
of like what, yeah, of what you're feeling. And I think it's interesting, right? It's both like men and women that are being assaulted in this case, which I think is even more powerful in that message of like how this like violence is so like messed up and so traumatic, and just like there's like so much deep things rooted, right? Like he's feeling moments of shame and about like the passiveness too, right? So, and I think like there's nothing that he could do, and I think that's so interesting when you're thinking about the context, like if outside of the book right now in the Me Too movement, and like that was something that like really rang to mind, or even just moments where you're like fake news, like while you're reading this book, and you just kind of cannot not draw like parallels to our current culture. And so I think the fact that it's both like men and women that are describing this, like especially Cronow, this like level of shame and passivity is really interesting when we're talking about things that we're also politically dealing with. You know, because there's that whole idea of like just say no, or why didn't you say no, right? And like right. I think again by putting it in a very internal mental place, that kind of, and putting in a fantastical brings it to a place that you wouldn't be able to with just writing about like kind of like a more physical rape, and more rooted in a little bit more reality, even though this feels so much like our reality.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I agree with that completely. I don't know what else to say about this. So it seems to me set up like through these 3 chapters we get to, so it's sort of good progression of like Cronauer's group, the setup of there, and then like this sort of coming together conflict, and it seems to be setting up that Cronauer versus Solovey
that's
battle.
On the horizon. Yeah,
assuming that everything like this works like a comic book movie, which is going to be my continual read. What are you gonna say, Hailey?
Something that I just thought was kind of cool. I don't know if you guys like felt this way, but I felt like as he was introducing the characters, just the narrative structure, it felt like kind of like passing the baton and like this relay. Like you introduce the character and then you get a part of this character, and then it kind of just flows like as the next person is meeting whomever, it just kind of gets passed along that way, rather than that shift of except like kind of like within separating chapters, like it would introduce like Samia or Samia when Cronow meets her, and then all of a sudden you like enter her mind, and then you get her backstory, and it kind of feels like this passing of the baton through characters, which I thought was interesting. I don't know, that's just kind of how I was reading it, but
yeah, no, I agree. I like how that works in here too. I think it's interesting that you use the little dots to separate the different sections.
Yeah, I do like the dots. I
feels as if it's like bullet points.
There's so much exposition to have to deal with for a book like this, for like setting up, you know, the history of the war, the history of everything. And so, yeah, that kind of weird narrative move of switching. You don't feel that it's exposition heavy, even though there's so much that has to be delivered to you.
Yeah. It's like the opposite of a Philip K. Dick novel, where in like the Philip K. Dick novel in the first 2 paragraphs is like all the setup is done immediately. And like, I like that because it's fun, and it's like, it uses like something crazy usually. Like you have to pay, the refrigerator's fighting with the narrator over not opening because he doesn't have any money to pay the refrigerator open. And suddenly like the rest of that world is like laid out in like 2 paragraphs, boom. And I like how this does it the opposite of that, of where you have like those bits where like we'll get to learn about the war and a bunch of different varieties, but through those characters' eyes, like exactly what you're saying. So like you get the fight, the Orbises fall and decline through Cronauer talking about the crazy commander, and then you get what the history of it was through her Gramma reading the papers, and you get like all those little components based on those people's experiences without it feeling like it's just one long layout all at once. And that's absolutely true. That's super cool. I like that a lot in here. So you have a favorite line?
Ooh.
It's a tough one.
There's like a lot of like actually really good one-liners in here, which I was impressed with. Let's see.
I already read the one that I was gonna say.
I definitely was writing down favorite plants as I went through.
Oh, maybe that's a better thing. What's your favorite
Because
plant?
there's some good ones.
What's your favorite plant?
Okay, I might butcher this because it's not, they
Not
are
a word.
words. Huckster tuberberry.
Huckster tuberberry.
Yeah, there's some good ashrangs, false
Yeah.
ryegrass, old
Sweet pollers.
captives. Yeah, there's so many good ones.
I like small glory captives.
Yeah, I wrote that one down too. Prairie the ruins. She's like, what?
I imagine we should make all of our guests draw one of these plants.
They're so ridiculous. Like, just like I can't even pronounce like half of these. Like Iglistia.
Yeah. Maybe that's a better game. We were gonna say that if you could send us your Volodine influenced dreams, you would win the books. Let's say draw us a plant.
God, these dreams are gonna be so dark. Don't have people do just like half of this is all just like violent mind rape. Like, what dreams did you have tonight?
Right. I hope that everyone does okay. But I'm sure that you will be greatly weirdly influenced by this book. But yeah, let's change that. So the new contest is you send us a drawing of a plant. One of the plants from here, you name it, you draw it. The coolest drawing wins. We will show all the drawings that we get. That's a lot easier.
That's perfect.
Let's do it. So next week we will be broadcasting on YouTube late on Wednesday night with Rachel Cardasco, who's speculative fiction and translation. Runs the website and is like huge into this book and into sci-fi and translation.
She reviewed this book when it came out as well.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that. Yeah. So she'll have a lot to say, and we'll be going over chapters 4 through 8, which is pages 78 through 127. As for today and tomorrow, if you're listening to this as it comes out, you can buy any Volodine book through our website by using the code Volodine at checkout, and you'll get 30% off. After that, it'll be reduced. He's our author of the month, so we've been featuring all of his books over the course of this month on 3% and elsewhere. So you should go buy it. That even applies to the ebooks. They'll be like $7. So if you're an ebook reader, just get all 3 of them. Come on, go for it. It's not that big of an investment. And it's well worth it. This is like $7 for like 500 pages, man. That's solid. That's good. You can also always follow us on open_letter at Twitter and Instagram. And I'm Chad W. Post at both of those places. And Anthony, you are
Anthony J. Blake.
All over. And Haley, you're a big Instagrammer.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Hey Hales is my Instagram name.
That's right. I forgot that. And are you on Twitter too, or are you not a?
Oh yeah, I'm like one of those like very passive Twitter people. Like I retweet everyone, but never like put myself out there because I don't feel like I'm witty enough for Twitter. Like everyone else is really smart, but then I'm just like sitting there like giggling to myself and reading people's tweets.
Fair enough. Not everyone can be Dustin Kurt. We don't need more Dustin Kurtzes on the Twitter.
Oh my God.
One is good. One is perfect. One is the right amount. One is the right amount. I have nothing else to say, so we'll be back next week. And until then, everyone take care. Stay warm, Haley. Don't die.
I'll try.
Don't freeze.
I'll try.